Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whatever time it is, whatever you're doing. Welcome to 0 Hour Thoughts with me, Jamie, co-hosting with my good friend.
As well.
Yep, it's good to see you as well.
Nice to see you as well.
Yeah. So today, you've probably noticed we're in a completely different environment. I'd like to thank my good friends Emma and Nick for letting us use this beautiful home for today. It's a really nice place, isn't it?
This is really, really beautiful. Like
Yeah.
I was saying, my friend, that if I would have a house, a establishment like this, that I would be content with my life.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
It's really beautiful here.
On a different note, what are we talking about today?
So today we're going to talk about a kind of serious topic. It is a very serious topic. We're going to talk about wars.
Yeah,
So
war.
lately, what we're saying is like more and more people are kind of idealizing war and saying, "Oh, we need to go into war" and all that kind of thing, without realizing how vicious and how brutal wars can be. So today we're going to talk about a brief history, the latest history that we know of wars, what we have learned from it, and the wars that's going around in the world. And we'll be reading some poems to recite basically what people, when they were in First World War, Second World War, in the trenches, how they felt. So it's from the perspective of a soldier rather than from the perspective of a general who might have never had to be in the ground, never had to be in the location where the bombs were being dropped, where the guns were being fired. So yes, we're going to talk about wars today.
And then afterwards we're going to talk about the lessons of war, this glorification of war, and how we can understand it and how you can understand it better. Because if we don't understand it, then it could be a reality in the future, which is what I don't think we need.
We're supposed to learn from history, but at this point it seems like we're not learning from history. We're not even trying to look at history anymore. It might be because we're too afraid of repeating the same thing, but that's the mistake we will do. It's like if we not learn from history, if we not look at the history, we are doomed to repeat it. It might not be the same. It might be even worse than what we have seen. So to start the podcast, I would like to start with the statement that goes around quite viral these days. It is, even though we claim that this is the most peaceful time to be alive in human history. Well, there are several areas in the world where this statement would not be true. There is war going on. There are conflicts going on around the world, which has taken countless lives, left millions of people homeless, millions of people without a state, and forced to live as people with no country to call home to. And left cities to the ground, countries into the deep crisis of every possible metric. And in these places there is nothing but crumbling buildings, decaying dead bodies, hungry children, blood-shedding citizens. The cries are unheard, their hunger is unfulfilled, and their struggles to find place of peace is named as invasions. But still, somehow, even after going through these unimaginable pain and suffering, there is still hope that someday this all will end. So the people who have been through that situation and who are in that situation, they still have faith and hope that someday their homeland will be peaceful. They will be able to go back to the place of their birth and once again build their lives on top of countless that couldn't escape the wrath that was brought upon them. And we know about the war in Israel, the war in Gaza, and the war in Ukraine, but there are other conflicts that we don't much know about, which we'll go on into detail in a bit. So now I would like to ask you a question. Okay. You are a history student.
Yes.
So you have way more knowledge on war and how brutal the war can be. So can you shed some light onto the brutality of the war?
Put me on the spot a bit, but that's completely fine. So for any of you that didn't know, I graduated last year. I did a bachelor's in modern history, and my dissertation was on the Wehrmacht, the German army in World War II. Specifically, I was focused on the actions that the men committed in the Wehrmacht army. I'd like to specify they're not the SS. The SS were the ones who were tasked with all the brutal and horrific atrocities against the civilians. Nonetheless, the Wehrmacht did have to participate in some of this horrific actions the SS did. And my question is based on a book called Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning, and it's questioning what sort of responsibility do normal family men have on the battlefield, and how far can they be pushed until we see that evil trait come out. And And from what I studied, I went to the British Archives in London, and I was reading from a selection of war prisoners and their conversations with their comrades in the jails in London. And the reason this was recorded is because they wanted to see what spies were saying, and they wanted to find out like any secrets, any tactics. But I was analysing it to see what sort of traits there were for camaraderie, traits of family values, and like where did their values really sit. Obviously, we can say they're all Nazis, they're all evil, but there were lots of brave men. There were lots of men that weren't too different from the British Army, as well as those crazy psychos. And what I found interesting was everything was often put into a game context. So, for example, there were these bombers in Norwich, and one of the bombers was bragging to his friend that he managed to get a train station and 2 towns one night, whereas the other guy only managed to get 1 town. So they made it like this game, and in a way that sort of disassociated them from the reality of their actions. And and I basically go into talk about things like that. Really, that's my dissertation.
It is really interesting, and you know the famous philosopher Slavoj Zizek, when he talks about Himmler, he says Himmler always used to carry a Hindu holy book with him, so that he could justify, so that he could basically say. Reading that book, like how to stay away from the actions he has created, that the actions he's doing are not related to himself.
It's like the responsibility is in God's hands in a sense, and that's why, like you're saying, Himmler, he used the Bhagavad Gita, and it was also used by this this scholar called D.T. Suzuki, and he was a Buddhist scholar, and he used the same arguments, saying that the people, the Japanese army, weren't responsible for what they did, basically, because it wasn't them doing it, essentially.
For them, it was ordained by God.
Yeah, but it's a wild justification of war, and also this makes you realise how widespread and normalised war was in the 1940s. Let's not forget, in the 1940s, roughly 80 million people died in like a 5-year period. That's unprecedented.
Yeah,
you know?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. It brought the kind of calamities to the world that we can never, that people of that time or people of this time as well, we can't imagine. We can't even start to think of how that was possible. Killing that many people, like basically targeting one particular group and then starting to kill them. Basically, so like the genocide.
I have a difficult question for you. How does like modern warfare differ to these old warfares? So World War II was considered a war of ideas. There was the Nazis who had this ideology they wanted to push, and they were led by generals. And how does that compare to old regimes, not just World War I, but wars of conquest, wars of kings? Like, why are they different?
Well, at this point, I would like to read a paragraph that from the last days of Socrates, that the Socrates talked about wars and what the wars were fought about, basically. So he says, wars and revolutions and battles are due simply and solely to the body and its desires. All wars are undertaken for the acquisition of wealth, and the reason why we have to acquire wealth is the body, because we are slaves in its service. So back in the days, when the war was declared, it was declared by kings most of the time. And the kings themselves, they went into the battlefield to fight. And most of the war, it was to basically... so the population grew in a particular place, and they didn't have enough resources to feed that population, or enough resources to basically home that population in a specific area. So they would go into the battles to, win more land, more arable land, or win more, basically land and wealth. So at that point, and it was basically to basically so that they could sustain the people that they had in their country. And it was king who was leading the army, and everyone was kind of motivated at saying, if the king is in the army, if the king is fighting for me, then I would fight for him as well. Yeah. So that's what we see in the wars, in the historical wars. Yeah. But these days, the people who declare war, they are sitting in somewhere like a beautiful apartment which has like different layers of security that no one can touch them, and they basically move the pieces like when you're playing a chess, and it's a 16-17-year-old who are bombarded by propaganda and who basically think that they're going to rescue their country, they're going to rescue basically their fellow men. and they have this idea, and they don't know the brutality of war, because the brutality of war is always like historically it has always been subsided. Like they never talk about it. They never talk about the fallen soldiers. They only talk about the people who came back from the war,
Right.
and how victorious they were. And
Mm.
so because of this, everyone thinks like, oh yeah, I can go into the war and come back and win it.
Okay.
And they have this idea, and so basically that propaganda like basically plagues their mind, and they go into fighting for
Do you
it.
think that's an old mindset, like from the conquest era?
I think it does come from old mindset, but at that time, at least the kings and the generals were basically declaring the war were in the front line. But these days, the people who declare the war, they are never
They're
in the
very
front
far
line.
back. You know,
Yes.
what, segueing to this, I was reading the World History Project, and they were talking about this idea of total war, and this comes hand in hand with modern warfare. So total is this idea that, like you were saying, of chess pieces being moved, and the mobilization of a whole culture. And according to World History Project, it's made of 4 components, this total war: resources, blurring of roles between soldier and civilian, no compromises, and total government control. And they characterize the First World War as the first total war. This is a bit of a disputed thing amongst historians. David A. Bell, he considers the Napoleonic Wars to be the first total war. In a sense, they were, because they were the first ever conscription. But it was really World War II that saw this mobilization of the whole country, really, and the merging of citizens with soldiers. And I don't really know where I was going with that, but it was sort of adding to that.
No, it's
Yeah.
it's yeah, we can definitely see where it originates from. Like basically, Bertrand Russell in his the lecture he was giving that was recorded by BBC. He basically talks about we human beings, we always have this ability within us to do atrocities that we can't think of. Like basically, we saw that in World War II as well. Like you don't necessarily need to have an ideology. Every person, they don't need to have ideology because of which they're willing to fight. You can force them to fight. So like you said, there is like a camaraderie for them. It's like a brotherhood for them. They're doing something just because their fellow men are doing it. And if they're against it, like you said earlier, they would not be like normal at that point. If they say, okay, this is not good that we're doing, then they're against it somehow.
Yeah,
they're not normal
they're the
somehow.
they're the small voice of reason, and that happens at times. There's the small voice which makes sense, but the big voice that doesn't make any sense.
Exactly. And so basically, to name the list of the wars and the conflicts that are going on around the world at this point, literally right now, is the first one that comes to everyone's mind is Israel war on Gaza.
And Ukraine.
And Ukraine.
I would say
Yes.
simultaneously, yeah.
And so more than 38,193 Gazans have lost their lives. And around 10 to 20,000 are missing. And there is no sign of this ending anytime soon.
That's shocking.
Like, we can't even imagine being in that situation where you don't know at what point the bomb is going to drop on the roof of your house, and you'll be left with no house, nowhere to go.
Hospitals were being bombed as
Imagine
well.
that.
That's outrageous. And I believe the justification for it was that there were enemies underneath the hospital, basically.
They always have justifications.
Well, that's the thing.
Yeah,
is that
exactly.
If you don't have a justification for a war, then you are sort of committing an act of terror on behalf of the government, and then I think you open yourself up to coups and revolutions. I think this is why you could argue this is why Russia had a revolution, is because their war wasn't justified in Europe, and all the people wanted was peace, land, and bread. So the first thing they wanted was get us out of this war. We don't want conscription. We don't need it, because they had no sense of purpose as to why they were doing that in the First World War.
Yeah. Like every generation that has seen war, that has been in the war or been through the war, they don't want it to happen. They don't want it to happen to their worst enemies. They don't want it to happen, period. Like, when we talk about cell shock people, like who had, now we call it, we give it like a soft word calling post-traumatic disorder.
Yeah.
But it is cell shocked, basically. They were in a war. They were, like, they saw things that we can never imagine would happen. Like seeing a human body, and there's nothing left of it apart from a splash of blood on the ground. and few minutes ago your friend was there, and now he's gone.
I guess movies don't really do it justice because
No.
you weren't there. You
Exactly.
But speaking of movies, do you have any like war movies that you particularly enjoy or find great symbolism in?
I think there is a series called The Band of Brothers.
Oh, okay. It rings a bell.
Yeah, so Band of Brothers, it's kind of similar to the Schindler's List one, but it's basically when they storm the Normandy, and then for the first time, the Western soldiers, they see the concentration camps. They have heard about it before seeing that, but when they see the concentration camps and see the people in the camps, in the situations that they were living in, and the way it moves them. It was really, really difficult to watch that. It's like, we know that happened, but when you see that kind of visualized, it's like, how can someone do this? How can any human being be capable enough of doing these kind of things? And it's not one person that does it. It's many people who are behind doing it, and they believe in it, and they believe they're doing something good. They believe they're doing something great. Yeah. And just that idea that like it can go from good, like, good, like we are good human beings, civil human beings, we are in this, like we have this brotherhood, we have this camaraderie between us, and then switch in a snap, and then my group is better than yours and we're going to kill you.
The Holocaust is something definitely terrifying, and to make you realize how evil the Nazis were, the logical thing to do when they were losing the war in 1944 would be to utilize the Jewish workers to help with the war progression, build shells, build guns or whatever. Actually, the Germans did the opposite. They sped up the execution process when they knew they were losing. So it shows you how truly evil the Nazis were. And in a sense, that's why a lot of people are very proud to say we won the Second World War. The Allies won the Second World War because it was a war against tyranny, against dictatorship, against brutalism. So I think it was a good justification.
Justified war, you think?
But we can't say that with a lot of wars. Even today's wars, it's not like because we live in the 21st century, everything's logical and rational and justified. To mention just one, the UN heavily disapproved what was called Iraq Freedom Operation in 2003.
They hate calling wars, don't they? They don't like to call these things wars.
It's not the word war anymore they were using, but it was essentially a war and an invasion of Iraq. And many people died in that, and it was totally unjustified because they didn't have these weapons that they claimed they had.
Yeah, weapons of mass destruction. Yeah, they openly said, like, they openly said, they were like, we just heard. There was one person in America who basically kind of persuaded the president and the generals to basically
shows you how powerful the bureaucracy is.
Exactly.
It's
crazy. Like, you don't even need evidence anymore. You can just, like, if someone is against an idea, then you can basically incite them with more idea, more propaganda.
While we're berating America, sorry to the American viewers, but I just want to point out some hypocritical points. Just one specifically. A few weeks ago, it was not far from here. We had the D-Day Memorial in Portsmouth. I think it was the 6th of June, I believe. And everyone was having speeches saying we need to perpetuate peace and stuff. The Europeans, I think they're quite aware of the values of peace. And then we had Mr. Joe Biden walk on stage and give a very dicey view of war. And you could laugh and say, well, that's just, he's a stupid president and stuff like that. But I don't think he's got a very strong mindset when it comes to things like war. Biden in Portsmouth, he was saying that Russia's a tyranny, Russia's a dictatorship, and they're similar to what we saw in the Second World War, and they need to be stomped out. So instead of suggesting peace, he's actually perpetuating these emotions that come with war, and he's suggesting that Russia's some sort of Nazi dictatorship, which I think really needs a lot of proof before suggesting something like that. What do you think about Russia, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, there is no defense. There is no defense for Russia. You can't support Russia in this invasion, what they're doing, But just the fact that the Western countries, they kind of pushed Zelensky not to go and have a table talk with Putin, it kind of shows like what kind of motivation this side has. Now, how can you say that side is so worse when you don't want to go and talk and have a conversation with them and like settle this?
Yeah.
So without having to lose 50,000
like
soldiers or
like
exactly.
adults. Yeah.
Like see, at this day and age, we would think that we have seen so many wars, we have seen so many atrocities, we have learned from it, and we're never going to go into wars. And the reason that countries, they were building their nuclear arms and all that was like, oh, this is like what's the word? I forgot the word. It's basically saying, okay, this is to avert the war. This is to so that we ensure that no one is going to bomb our country.
It's like anti-terror.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So apparently that was the idea, but it hasn't stopped countries from going into war. They might not have war in their country, but they will have the proxy war in other country.
Yeah.
Like Iran and Saudi Arabia, they're fighting in Yemen, and people of Yemen, they're dying.
Yeah.
Like more than millions of people are dying because they don't have enough food to eat. Like, just imagine being a mother and a father of a kid who is malnourished and who is eating his own hands because they don't have any food to eat.
Yes. It's shocking.
Just imagine that. And you might think that you are in like a Western country where you have all the resources that all the resources that is produced within your country. The food grows in your country, you have the oil and like all the gas and everything that you need in your country, so you're not like basically dependent on another country. But like what if that gets bombed out?
Yeah.
What after that? What are you going to do? You can't go and hide in the jungle, you can't go and hide in the forest. Like, how are you going to survive? So and it won't be only you, there will be many people who will try to flee the war because no one wants to be in the war.
Yeah.
Like people who are like, those stupid people who say, oh yeah, like, we need to send these kids to war because they are turning left wing apparently. And like they are saying they are this and that and that, and they idealize with this kind of gender, that kind of gender. They need war. We need strong people. It's like, well, that's not the way to make them strong if you think they are weak. Isn't it silly to think that war is going to fix this situation?
It's like what you're saying earlier, the chess pieces. It's like you're not going to build strong citizens by turning them into chess pieces. And also on this point of proxy war, I think that's a real testament to this war of ideas as opposed to historical wars of conquest. So maybe historically, if Saudi Arabia and Iran had a problem, they would meet halfway. And then that's how they would conquer and sort their territories. But in this day and age, we can't do that. A lot of that's to do with mutually assured destruction. So since the 1960s, it's basically impossible to have a war. Everything is done proxy, which is why Ukraine is quite worrying, because this is one of the first wars of international... Well, I say one of the first wars of international. It's the only European war since World War II.
Yeah,
so,
well...
Yeah. And
as if only those wars matter.
That's why possibly it's raising attention. The war's becoming questionable.
Definitely. And so yeah, like so if you're fighting from the Russian side, you have justification for what you're doing. If you're fighting from Ukrainian side, you have justification for what you're doing, because they will always find justification to shove it down your throat. If you're and I'm talking to the people who will be the soldiers in the future if we are to go into a war. You might think that there is no imminent danger. Like, as long as you have the ability to send good morning message in your WhatsApp every morning that you wake up, like, you are free. You have all the freedom in the world that you can have. And as soon as that goes away, then yeah, we're fucked basically. And then to think that like, how Albert Einstein said it. He said it perfectly when he was asked, oh, what do you think what kind of weapons they will use in World War III? And he says, well, I don't know what kind of weapons they will use in World War III, but I know in World War IV they will use sticks and stones to fight against each other.
Because of total destruction.
Because of total destruction.
Wow. Well, I've said this before, and this is one of my points I like to raise, is that the human tendency to create conflict is far more catastrophic of a risk than any disease or natural disaster or economic failure in the 21st century. And I believe that's because of the unpredictability of humanity. And I think that has the greatest consequences.
I want to ask you something.
Yeah.
Like, we were listening to Bertrand Russell earlier, and Bertrand Russell, he was very vocal about, being against the World War One. He supported World War II, but he was very against World War One. Yeah. And he thinks that the England's participation in World War One was a mistake, and because of World War One, it gave rise to communism, the Nazis in Germany, and the World War Two, the inevitable World War Two, and the threat of World War Three. Yeah. So he thinks that World War One was unjustified. Why do you think that he might be right on that point?
That's a tricky one. So, if we're talking about European peace, there was something called Pax Britannica, which happened after the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. We had a 50-year period in Europe of no war. Then Germany invaded France in the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, I believe. And that was instability. Then we had peace until 1914. And that started because of a conflict of interests. Germany were growing their empire before World War II. Since the Franco-Prussian War, the state of Germany existed. There was Bismarck, who had this great vision. And actually, 10 years before Bismarck died, in, I believe, 1890s, he said, in the next 10 years, we're going to see a great war again. And he wasn't wrong. They did. And part of that was this conflict of interests, especially empire growing, which happened in the 1800s. And Bismarck helped progress Germany into Africa under this idea called New Imperialism. This scared France and Germany, France and England, Britain, who were building their empires, because some of these territories were now being taken by Germany, and they didn't like that very much. So they created something called the Triple Alliance, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So that was France, Russia, and Britain, and they were allies, essentially. And all of this was top down. So all of this was, our generals don't like this thing happening in this region, so we're going to support you. So all of it was like buddies from the generals who were deciding, this is my friend, this isn't my friend. And then all of that came to a crashing point when the Serbian, I'm not sure if I remember this correctly, a Serbian gang leader shot the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Austria-Hungary. Russia stepped in for Serbia. Austria obviously declared war on Serbia, which meant they were now at war with Russia.
Yep.
Germany stepped in to declare war on Russia because they were friends with Austria-Hungary. And then because Russia was in the war, they also were allied to Britain and France, who were at war with Germany. And actually Belgium was invaded, which was Britain's ally. So all of it is about who's your friend and
who are you going to defend?
Exactly. And actually, I believe more generals as a percentage died in the First World War than soldiers. A hell of a lot of soldiers did die, but generals were killed more frequently, essentially.
But in Second World War?
In Second World War, pretty much the opposite.
Yeah.
Pretty much the opposite. It was definitely the masses against the masses. So the masses of democracy were fighting the masses of totalitarianism.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy to sit here in this day and age and say, that's so silly, obviously democracy is going to win, but you can't tell if it's so obvious. You know, at the time and place, Germany might have even made the nuke before we did. They made the jet engine. Yeah. You know, we could be in a totalitarian state now, but fortunately we're not.
Yeah. So that is thanks to a justified war. So World War II was justified.
But that's not to say there weren't atrocities committed on the Allies. So the Allies did some disastrous stuff too. Yes. Not to mention Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yeah.
And bombing of Dresden as well.
Dresden, 70% was flattened by the RAF. Yeah. The RAF basically destroyed a beautiful ancient European city along with thousands of civilians. I'm sure it could even be hundreds of thousands of civilians that the RAF killed in Germany. Yeah. So all war is awful, essentially.
Yeah, definitely. Like even loss of one single life is a tragedy. Yeah. And loss of thousands, like you know, when we, I think it has been such a normal thing for us to hear. Like thousands of people visited this place, thousands of people visited that place, thousands of people come to this place every year to see this thing. So that word thousand is so common in our head that when we hear thousands of people died in a war, it sounds a lower number. It doesn't. It's not like for us to consider that how bad a war is. Like we need like numbers in millions or hundreds of thousands. Like somehow 10,000s number doesn't justify. Like doesn't make our head go crazy. Like when we think of war that's going around in the world.
I have a crazy thing to bring up. It's the Great Leap Forward by Mao Zedong, the communist leader. I believe it was like 60 to 80 million civilians were killed. Yeah. We don't consider that a war, but it was a civil war. So why is that not like bigger importance than or equal importance to the Second World War? Because hell of a lot of people died. Just
Yeah.
most of them were Chinese.
Yes.
So why?
I think it's
yeah.
because the World War One, it kind of happened only in Europe.
So do you think it's the Europe aspect that gets?
Yeah, and they still call it
okay.
World War One, World War.
Yeah.
And the World War Two happened around the world.
Mm.
So I think it's good to. I think it's in the nomenclature. It's basically like when you don't consider it as a world war or a grand war or a big war, then people don't really care about
Yeah,
it.
but it was still a grand war.
It was
and
like
you could argue it
hundreds-
wasn't just a civil
Yes.
war because China's always been made of different cultures. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
It was like basically it was kind of like a war between. It could have been different countries, like China invaded Tibet as well, and that was also a part of war.
Mm.
And the thing that Pol Pot did,
Mm.
like the most absurdest thing, like most cruelest thing he did. And when you count, okay, who is the most most hated dictator in the world?
Or
Evil dictator in the world is Hitler, Stalin, yada yada yada. And you might find Pol Pot in that ranking, but you might not even find him. And I think it's important for us to learn about that as well. Like people everywhere around the world, they have suffered. There have been genocides around the world. There have been genocides in many countries. And it's hard for us to learn for all these things. It's like, why do I care? Because it's not happening in my country. It's not happening here. It's like, well, if you don't learn about it, you will not see the signs of that thing happening.
I agree.
So that's why when people call it the genocide in Gaza, that's what people mean. It's like the signs of genocides are already there, and we know what genocide looks like, and we can see the similarities happening in Gaza. We don't want that to happen.
Yeah.
And we want to stop it, and that's why people are protesting. And we also hear that, okay, what's the point of me being in UK or America or anywhere in Europe and protesting for the ceasefire in Palestine? And it's like, you need to look at the history.
Yeah.
When you look at the history, like during the apartheid, the end of apartheid, it was not only because of the fighting in South Africa, it was also because the pressure built up by the students around the universities, around the cities, around the world, where the countries had to step up and they were to say, yes, you need to sort this out. And that's something what like Biden was trying to do in this Gaza conflict, but I don't know. It almost seems like no one wants to listen to America, and also the thing is like, okay, why would they listen to America? Because it's not being like involved in it. But then America is the biggest supporter of Israel.
That's
So,
a conflict of interest once again. I have quite a difficult question for you.
Okay.
So you're quite anti-war, it strikes me as, for good reason.
Well, unjustified war. Yeah.
Yes. I just wanted to say, as a difficult question, theoretically,
Okay.
if you were the leader of Nepal
Okay.
and you had to defend, in a sense, your home nation from an attack, your country's in between two international powers, China and India. If one of them attacked your country, what would you do?
Well, I think I would. I don't think I would be fool to say that we will lose the war. If China were to attack, then we would have kind of like a more time to save our people.
Would you fight?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Like, look, I need to save my nation. I need to save my people. We have this poem in our country. It's like, where would we Nepali live if we don't have Nepal anymore?
Oh wow.
So,
That's
and that is deep in my heart, and I think that's deep within every Nepalese people, Nepalese heart. Basically, it's like we're very proud of who we are, and so basically we have had conflict with China. We have had conflict with Tibet specifically back in the days, and we kind of won that war. And but now, if China were to attack our country, and everyone thinks, oh, if they drop one nuke in Kathmandu, and everything would be flattened because there are around 3 million, 4 million people in the capital, and it's a valley, and if you drop in there, then everything is destroyed.
Wow.
But even if they don't drop a nuke, if they just cut off our borders, even if they drop a bomb in one of the major like bridge over the rivers, over the like large rivers in our country, we would be suffocating after that.
Wow.
We'd be dying of hunger. We'd die of lack of medicine and all that.
Yeah,
so that's the thing to do with China.
What about India?
And that's even more problematic because there are many Nepalese people who fight for India in Indian army. So this is the legacy of British East India Company and British Empire in India, basically. That when they were leaving, they were also like, "Oh yeah, we have these many troops from Nepal that we hired. We want you to keep it." That's what they said
they
to
gave them to the
Indians. Yeah, and they were more than happy to take it because they were getting basically
soldiers,
trained soldiers, and so basically the idea was, oh, you're going to be paid a bit more. So it's basically mercenary, but we don't like to call it mercenaries because the word mercenary has like a bad connotation.
I mean, they were there at the king's coronation, the Gurkhas.
Yes. So Gurkhas are also in the British Army, like we said in one of our first podcasts as well, that I went quite into detail of talking about Gurkhas. We're very proud of Gurkhas, but just the idea of that the Nepalese brothers will have to kill other Nepalese brother in order to participate in that war. It's just dreadful. I can't even imagine being in that situation, that in Indian Army, like there will be Nepalese Gorkhali, we call them, like the bravest of brave. And
do you think if that happened, the Gurkhas would turn against the Indians in their own army?
I think so, yes, because even though they are in Indian Army, they are very proud of being Nepalese. They are very proud of being. I'm not questioning. We have all these sayings in Nepal and India that goes like, oh, if you eat the salt from one master, you need to serve the master. So because in Indian Army there are Nepalese Gorkhas and they are getting paid by Indian Army, they need to serve. So some people might have that kind of idea. So I can't say for sure that everyone will turn against the Indian Army, and I don't think it will be justified of me that I'm the furthest away from the Gorkha army that you can find in my country.
Okay.
So our family, we don't have historical tie. Our family doesn't have anyone who was enlisted in the Gorkha army or in the other army, but we do have people who are in our Nepalese army, and I know how much they love other Nepalese people. This kind of brotherhood. Like we speak the same language, we eat the same food, we like the same music, we watch the same movies, and just the fact that when the Indian army were to come to the border with the guns and with the tanks and everything that they have got, and there will be Nepalese people standing, and we kind of believe that they will put them in the front line, because it would be, if you think from the strategic point of view for India, it would be quite beneficial, I guess.
That's an interesting thing to talk about.
Yeah, and so basically Nepalese brothers will be killing other Nepalese. It's like a civil war kind of, but even worse, because when you lose everything. You lose your humanity, you lose your country, you lose your people, and you lose your humanity at the end. And I don't think after that anyone would be proud to call themselves as Nepalese people. Will be basically our kinslayers. We killed our kin.
I just want to go on a little bit of tangent, but sort of linked to this. You're talking about possibly they put the Nepalese on the front line. Why do you think that?
Well, it's disposable for them.
Yes,
they won't
this
be
happens, doesn't it?
they won't be answerable. Like no one would be questioning. Oh yes, so in India, like no one would be. I don't think there might be people, generous people who have this critical thinking capability who will be against it. Of course, they will be against it because we Indians, Indians and Nepalese, we're brothers. We're brothers in arms. But in that virtual scenario where that would happen, it's like. No one in India would be protesting, saying, "Oh, why are our people in the front line?"
Yeah, it's always considered inferior to put the person at the front line, right? Because the person at the front line is what you call cannon fodder.
Exactly.
So they go first, and they receive basically hell from the other side, and then that gives way for the next wave.
Yeah.
And this happens internationally. I believe it happened in the British Army, right? They put the Gurkhas first, and you can say whatever reason you want, but the truth is that the people put at the first are normally ones that the least cared about.
Yeah.
This also happened in the American army, so the Jim Crow army were put in front.
Yeah.
It's kind of a shocking thing that happens in war, right?
Yeah, but to go back to the Indian and Nepalese conflict, I don't think we would ever go into war with India. Even in virtual scenario, so. I can't think of any reason why.
I think you're too linked.
Yes, we are.
The thing is, you're too linked to India, and at the same time, I think you're too distant from China, I don't think you would be invaded.
Yeah, but that was the basically why the Indian government was kind of scared, basically scared when when Nepal started increasing its links with China, because we're heavily dependent with one country, because geographically it's easier to access Indian market than for us to access the Chinese market. But because of the blockade and everything that came after blockade, we were like, we need to branch out. Yes. Yeah. Like the things are so bad. Like when you think about, in order to get a new flight permission, in Nepal. Like if we were to like in Nepal, they are building so many basically airports, unnecessary airports as well in places. They're building it, but in order to get planes to land on those airports, you need permission from India to fly over the Indian airspace.
Wow, that's crazy.
And Indian airspace is like, oh, we'll only give you this much. We can't give you more than this. They even count the number of passengers that can fly over it. So it is a very, like, being from a landlocked country is the worst thing.
I would like to say one benefit of being a landlocked country, especially the one you are in, is that you are like a default peace peace area between India and China, because the India-China is not a peaceful border.
Yeah, well, that's what our late king Birendra Saha wanted to establish Nepal as the kingdom of peace. That was a good idea.
They're like this. Well, when I say king, I didn't say kingdom of peace, but when I say this
it's like a buffer zone. Yeah,
buffer zone. That's it. But then again, if there were a war, India, China, Nepal would suffer a great deal.
Definitely. Like we would be basically like what like Denmark was for like for Nazi. Like it's like there's just a went through that. It's like nothing stopping you. And
not only that, but there'd be a lot of skirmish there, because that would be the line between India and China.
Yeah.
So there would be lots of attacks there.
And we, our country is very diverse. We have people from every like imaginable ethnic group, which have family ties with Tibet and China, and which have family ties with India in the south border as well. And just to imagine that, like what would happen. Yeah, it's worse. It's like basically a few years ago there were these. So in India, the religion plays quite a very big deal in terms of election and politics and all that. And there was a leader who was trying to do the similar thing in Nepal as well. For a short term, they might get votes and all that, but in long term, when you think, it's like, well, that's the only thing that's combining our country. It's like the respect and camaraderie that we have for each and every people that is in our country. And if that goes away, our country will be basically, it would be destroyed.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine that.
Yeah.
Yes. Well.
Any questions for me?
Yes, I do have questions for you. You know that funny sketch called As Minister, where they say, where the guy asks the prime minister, oh, why do we need nuclear weapons? He's like, oh, I don't know why we need nuclear weapons. And the secretary comes and says, oh, we don't need nuclear weapons to swim against the Russians. So he's talking about the Russians. We need it to protect against the French.
Oh, interesting.
Because we were in like wars with them for the longest period of time imaginable.
True.
What do you think about that?
That's a very interesting point. That's really been forgotten, actually, because there was 100-year war between France and England. They were... I think besides China and Japan, France and England have had the most wars against each other as a nation. And that's been going on for maybe a few thousand years.
Yes.
There was the 100-Year War. It seems like it's an old relic lost in time. In the 1300s and 1200s, the I forget what it's called, the Plantagenet family, they were the royal family who had heavy links to France. So the interests of England and France were very linked. And actually Britain is called Great Britain, and that's named by the French, because we were called Grande Bretagne, because Little Bretagne is Brittany in northern France. So, and actually, what the king used to say, I think it was King Henry VIII, he would say, King of England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales and France.
Yeah. Okay.
So they would claim, and France would say the same thing.
Yeah.
France would say King of France and the British Isles.
Yeah.
So they would claim each other's territories. That seemed to have stopped. I think the Napoleonic War. So the Brits are very, very proud about this. It was the Battle of Waterloo.
And yes, I've heard about it.
Yeah, so that was a success for Britain, and they successfully stopped an invasion under what's his name? Oh shit! Everyone's going to be going, it's this guy. It's the admiral.
Yeah.
I forget the admiral's name.
Oh yeah. Well, basically, I think British and French people are basically like how we Nepalese and Indians people are. We're brothers. Like we have had few hiccups now and then, not as bad as England and France, but we at the end we are the closest border to each other. We're the closest. We have the our economic ties go way back. and historical ties, the family ties. People intermarries from this country to that country. People want to go and live in southern England, southern France, and like French people want to come and see all the Scottish Highlands and all that. So I think there is that kind of camaraderie now.
There was the peace that came after the Napoleonic Wars, and there was also the wave of new imperialism. So France had their French Indochina, for example, which is Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. And Britain had the British Raj up to Myanmar, Burma. And then you had Thailand in between. Yeah. So Thailand was this buffer state between England and France. So England and France, they would sort of be on neutral terms. They'd be like, you don't touch my space, I don't touch your space. And that's sort of why war never really continued in Europe until obviously the big ones.
Well, at the time, French and British empires were one of the largest in the world, and the remnants of the French and British empire are still
languages,
there.
Really.
Yeah, like French. I think France has one of the most, as a country, they have one of the most varied. They have time zones in the world, and their territory lies in the most variable time zones in the world, because they have got some islands in Pacific, some in Indian. They've got like a whole country in Latin America and all that. And talking about wars, let's get back to the list of the wars that is happening right now. There was a war between the Sudanese armed force and the Rapid Support Forces, which is basically a power competition and resources between rival factions of the regular armed forces. And in this war, as of 21st January 2024, at least 13,000 to 15,000 people have been killed.
Wow.
33,000 were injured. And as of 5th July 2024, 7.7 millions were internally displaced, and more than 2.1 million had to flee the country as refugees.
That's shocking. It's really
shocking. The country that has got the most amount of refugees is Chad. And Chad, they were going through. They were kind of going through the famine already before this, before the refugees, and now because there are so many people as refugees in Chad, that the likelihood of famine going around in Sahel region, in that sub-Saharan region, is very, very high. And also the conflict, because many countries in that part of the world have basically these Al-Qaeda linked Boko Haram terrorist organizations in their country, and they do atrocities with the people. And that's also unimaginable situation. And there is Yemeni civil war, which is going on ever since 2014. It has settled down a bit, but I mean, we can't say for sure by not being in there. And it is estimated, UN estimates that 377,000 people lost their lives in that war, and 70% of them were children under the age of 5.
That's horrific. That's really, really horrific. Yeah.
And there is gangs war in Haiti, and there is a kind of civil war in Myanmar now. And there are lots of conflicts, internal conflicts going on in Latin America and in African countries as well.
It's not all bad. I mean, there's a lot of bad. I was watching this thing yesterday about El Salvador and the president of El Salvador. And who was he doing an interview with? Ted something? Is that his name?
Oh, the guy from the Fox News.
Yeah.
What's his name?
Is it Ted Cruz?
No. Oh, what's his name? He did the Putin's.
I think it is Ted Cruz.
Okay.
Anyway, he was doing an interview with the president of El Salvador, and he said, "How did you do it?" And he said, "Well, it's basically just increase police, increase military." And then the interviewer was like, "Yeah, that sort of makes sense." But then he was like, "But how did it happen? Like, because there could have been more protests." And his response was, "It's a miracle." So I mean, this sort of goes to show in a way that peace is a miracle, and it's not the default state of humanity. It's not like human nature's default state is peace.
Well, it was good until he brought up about the Christianity. He did the same thing with Putin as well. He's like trying to say these are the Christian leaders in the world. Like, they are the forebearers, flag bearers of the Christianity and all that. And it all goes to show, like, everyone has biases, everyone has sides. It's like they just want to fit their idea and make sure that their idea is correct. And that's the worst thing that we could do, because at this day and age we got to listen to other people. We need to go and have talks with them. Like, we got to be civil. Like, the main thing back in the days in like 1800s, 1700s was like, it's like civilians versus barbarians. So we are the civilized society and they are the barbarians, and we're going to fight against the barbarians.
I think speak for yourself. That's what I would say. I would say your country is just, that's it. It's a name, it's a place. You've got your passports, you've got your currency, you've got your government, you've got your courts. The people are in their culture, they decide if they are the barbarians or if they are the civilized people. If you're going to act in a stupid manner, then people have every right to call you barbarians, in my opinion. It doesn't matter how much money your country has. It doesn't matter what your history is. If your current culture is acting in a barbaric manner, we should call you barbarians. That's at least my opinion.
Yeah, but I agree with that. I agree with that. It's like, yeah, you gotta be answerable to the things that's going on in your country.
Definitely.
And before you go and basically start being the savior of the democracy or savior of the free world or something like that, because every country, they have their own problems, they're going through it. Yes, of course, in some situations the help is needed. Like Haiti desperately needs help from other countries so that they could, like, basically get rid of the gang violence in there. The gang violence in that country is like, it's unimaginable. The amount of rape cases, the amount of violence against women is like, we can't even imagine the things going on in there. And just because it happens away from, like, in the eyes of the media, like they called the Sudanese war, they called it like the forgotten war. Now, if you search the forgotten war, like there are so many documentaries by BBC, Al Jazeera, and all those channels. At least Al Jazeera kind of reports on those kind of war. They all have biases, but they kind of report on that war. Like all these, like media, they don't even talk about it, and it's a forgotten war. I'm like, who forgot it? Who forgot to report it?
They
it's like
it.
You are the people to be blamed.
It's ignoring problems, which countries that call themselves civilized, they do a lot. They ignore the world, and then they think they have the right to protect the world.
Exactly.
Like for example, with Haiti, Trump called it the shithole of America. I believe that's what he said. And basically, it's their backyard, their messy backyard. And there was an interview with a Haitian, and he said, well, if it's your backyard, go clean it.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yes. And yeah, like everyone hates war. No one likes war. We don't want to be in war. Do you want to be in a war? Do you want to fight in a war? No. Not. I don't think there is anyone out there crazy enough to say that, oh yes, I want to fight in a war. I like the sound of the bomb dropping. I like the sound of the bullets hitting my friend's head, and all those unimaginable things that we can think of. No one wants to be in a war, but we fantasize it.
Sorry, this is just making me think. What about things like video games, which are simulations of war? Like there's the adrenaline rush they can find. There's a sense of play game. That, do you think? Well, I would say that should be kept in the domain of online environment in fun, recreational ways.
So I think we'd have to look into the empirical evidence for that. Like, does it actually make people more violent?
Because I know that Hillary Clinton wanted to ban it, actually. That was her campaign.
But there is not much empirical evidence to say that video games make you violent.
Do you think it's a good alternative vent to warfare?
Yeah, you could argue in that way. Like, people are basically taking out their frustration in it. But then if they have the need of taking out the frustration, like, where does the need come from in the first place? I think we need to address that as well. Like, rather than saying, okay, this is the place where I think it's
what if it's testosterone?
Or like, during the gladiator period, where like to basically conquer the minds of civilians in your country, what you do is like you have these massive festivals, you have these gladiator wars every day of the week where people can go and forget about what's going on in the country. I think video games or something like that. You can argue of video games of something like that, because if those people stopped playing video games and came out, I mean, like, and start looking for jobs, start looking at having deep conversations about the country, and start getting participated in like democracy and all the different aspects of democracy. I think people would say they would be overwhelmed. Like our traditional, bureaucratic system, our traditional democratic system even, and all these systems that we have in place would be like basically overwhelmed by the people and their attention that they're trying to bring in.
Interesting.
So yeah, it's war is horrible, man.
Should we talk?
War is horrible.
Should we wrap it up? What do you reckon?
I think so. I think if I have come across in this podcast as a very emotional person who couldn't stitch a sentence and talk about it very perfectly, it's because I'm very emotional about this thing. It's like I'm not passionate. I'm very emotional about like just the idea of how people are suffering around the world, because
you care. It's clear that you care.
Yeah, because we could have been in that situation.
Yeah.
We're just fortunate that we're not born in Syria, in Iraq. We're not born in Libya. We're not born in Gaza. We're not born in Ukraine at this point. We're not born in like Russia even. We're not born in...
Don't take it for granted. That's
exactly.
What you're saying, right?
It's like that's... the freedom that you have, that every day you can wake up in the morning and send good morning message in a WhatsApp to the person who is living in the other side of the world, and they can reply you as soon as, like, in a blink.
And you can walk down
we
the
we got to
road
be fortunate about
perfectly.
that.
Really.
Exactly. Like,
Yeah.
you're not scared. You're not afraid of, like, will I be
Like
able
a
to eat
soldier
today?
inspecting you or something. Like that's not going to happen to you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, you're not scared that you might not have food in the evening. You're not afraid that, like, by the time you come back, the house that you called home for your generations might be just a rubble.
This reminds me of
Yeah.
something. Talking about gratitude, I mentioned this earlier. What's his name? Marty McFly. What's his name? The
Well,
actor.
I'm really bad at those
Everyone's
things.
going to be telling me who. Michael J. Fox. Yeah, Michael J. Fox. He said recently that gratitude is the recipe for optimism. So if you're not grateful, then you can't be optimistic about the future. So, and I think that's quite like inspirational. I thought
We've got to be very grateful for those
Yeah.
things. Well, before ending the podcast, I would like to read few poems. I have
Go for
one
it,
very
yeah.
long poem
Yeah.
and one short poem. So the first poem that I'm reading is Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing these things perfectly. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge. Till the haunting flares we turned our back, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, blood-sod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even in the hoods of gas cells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy, a fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in a fire and lime. Dim through the misty panes, the thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, and drowning. In the same smothering dream, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes withering in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin. You could hear at every jolt and the blood coming gargling from the fourth corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as cod, of vile, incurable source on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high jest to children's ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, Dulce et Decorum Est. Pro Patria Mori.
that was great.
This poem touches. This poem vividly paints the picture of when the mustard gas was dropped during the wars. Like, yeah, I can't imagine.
They weren't
Can't
aware.
imagine
They
the
weren't
situation.
aware of what they
Yeah,
created.
they were not. They were
It's
not
like
aware. Like,
Frankenstein's monster. It's
it-
like they weren't aware of the disaster, the evil they had created.
it was
yeah.
it was like a mist. It was like just a regular smoke.
And that could
And
the wind
yeah.
could push that back
Yeah.
on themselves as well.
Yeah.
It's uncontrolled destruction. That's what it is.
Yeah.
I guess that's a metaphor for war as a whole, really.
After this war, they made various rules. Like, these are the weapons that you're not allowed to use
Yeah.
in the war, and these are.
That's,
and
that's
and,
it.
and
I
I
think it's
think
interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say that there are restrictions you can make, but at the same time, a war crime isn't a crime when you're in a war.
Yeah.
You know, so people make these poor choices under poor circumstances.
And who is to say they're not going to do it? Like, just even one incident will push all the buttons that they were there. It's like, if there is one side in the modern warfare where they were to unleash the biological weapon or the chemical weapons, like, who is to say it's not going to lead to, like, the mass destruction of the whole place?
Like
And yeah.
radiation fallout.
Yes, exactly. There's another poem. It's called Suicide in Trenches. Some people who might have difficulty with the words that are being used in these poems, I would advise you not to listen through the poem. It's written by Siegfried Sasson. I knew a simple soldier boy who grinned at life and empty joy, slept soundly through the lonesome dark, and whistled early with the lark. In winter trenches, cowed and glum, with crumbs and lice and lack of rum, he put a bullet through his brain. No one spoke of him again. You smoked fence crowds with kindling eye, who cheer when a soldier lad marched by. Sneak home and pray you will never know the hell where youth and laughter go.
Interesting.
This poem, it basically shows you the mentality of people during the wartime in different places. The ones who are in the trenches and the ones who are in the safe, under the safe roof of their house. Like when they see the soldiers, when they march by to go into the war, everyone is cheering. It's like, yeah, this is a good thing. This is the best thing you could do with your life. But the warrior, the soldier who is fighting in the war in the other side, it's completely different.
Yeah,
and we would
interesting
dissociate
to
with
think
them.
about.
Yeah.
That I've not actually thought about that before.
Yeah.
Like, it's seen as so dignified and prideful
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah.
But then the people who are doing it, they're in the mud, they're, infected or starved.
There is no humanity.
Yeah.
There is no humanity left anymore. It's like they're basically like zombies, and they're forced to be like zombies. It's not even their fault. It's not their fault. Of course, it's not their fault. And whenever we hear from the veterans, like, when they talk about the war and the people they had to kill, they say, okay, there was this young lad in the other side who didn't even know what he was fighting for, and I had to kill that person.
Yeah, I think I've seen that.
And also, like, when you see the German veterans and the from the western side, when they meet with each other, they don't hate each other.
But then again, that sense of hate might be from the familiarity. So the cultures that aren't familiar, maybe it's easier for them to fall down those traps.
It's like how we basically demonize the people from the other cultures. Like, it's easy when someone doesn't look like you to demonize them.
It's the other, I think.
Yeah, it's the other, yeah. So we should get rid of this other.
Yeah.
We all are humans. When you cut, we all bleed the same.
Exactly.
We
all laugh, we all cry.
Yeah.
We all
we all have children. We all have parents. We all have people who we love. We all have people who we might have a bit of, kind of not hatred, but kind of like, oh, I don't like this person kind of feelings with. And
as advice, I would say have that chat with someone that you wouldn't normally talk to.
Exactly. Go and talk with people, and well, not everyone is very emotional, so you might be able, like me, so you might be able to have good conversation with them. I believe I get very touchy with this topic, and I tend to go away from the topic that I want to talk about.
Yeah.
But basically, go and talk with people.
It doesn't have to be about war. It doesn't have to be about your differences in culture.
Yeah. Just go and talk about the best roast dinner that you ever made, or the barbecue that you were trying to make and eat, but you suddenly have to leave behind.
That was a dignified barbecue. We did a good barbecue, I think. Have to do that again at some point.
At this point, with that few poems and all the statements that we gave, is there a 0-hour thought that you would like to say? Do you know?
Can I just say, I'll take this time. I don't have a 0-hour thought, but I would like to conclude on war, and say there's no successful conclusion we can make about this conversation, because war is not a simple thing, and it's very, very messy. And it's difficult to draw conclusions as to why it happens. But I think as humans, we all know it shouldn't happen. And I think we should maintain that sentiment.
Definitely. The cost of war is so high that we can't calculate it in monetary value. Nor we can calculate the amount of lives lost and the humanity that dies. So the only thing that war brings is pain and suffering, like you said. It's like we can't judge.
Yeah.
And like suffering of the kind that we have never witnessed. We lose things that we never would have thought of. Like, we could even lose them. Our dignity.
Yeah. You have a 0-hour
our pride. Well, this is my 0-hour thought that goes with
let's
you.
Hear it.
Yeah. And we will see things that we could have never think possible of seeing. We'll lose ourselves. We will lose our lives, our youths, our sanity, our humanity. And at the end, we'll lose ourselves. And what is there to fight for if there is nothing that is going to remain at the end?
We should leave it there.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for being with us so far. I'm not really sure how it went today. Yes, this topic is difficult for both of us to talk about, and hopefully we would be mature enough at some point and come back to this and talk about this in a more mature way.
It's not easy for anyone, I don't think.
No, I think being a young person at this day and age, where we see all these things going around, it kind of touches us quite a bit more. Of course it does for everyone else, but like when we think we have so much to lose, like, you know, our 75% of our life is still there to be lived, and just the idea of that, the amount of suffering that might come.
It's not worth it for one moment. It's not worth it. And I just want to say one last thing before we wrap it up. It'd be great to get some proper mugs. Our cameraman suggested it once again. I thought of it before, but we'll get some Zero Hour Thoughts mugs. That would be great. And also I'd like to say thank you once again to Emma and Nick for letting us record in their beautiful home. One day hopefully we can have a beautiful home like this too.
Oh yes, that would be amazing.
Yes,
like, imagine having this kind of setup. I would be like, my dream came true. And thank you, Lovan, for our amazing videographer and editor.
Thank you.
And thank you our friend who joined us today, Jerome, who is here. And thank you everybody. I'm really grateful that you guys are here.
Thank you.
Bye.